Okay, so we're about to unpack the story behind the most popular book ever written. But really, this isn't just about a book. It's an incredible journey that stretches across thousands of years, from ancient whispers passed down between generations, all the way to the screen you're looking at right now.
First, just try to get your head around this number. The Bible wasn't just written in a weekend, or, even in a single lifetime. Its 66 books were put together over a staggering 1.5 millennia. Can you imagine a single story, a single theme, being woven together across that huge an expanse of human history?
And this wasn't just one person's project. We're talking more than 40 different authors. You had kings, fishermen, prophets, poets, people from completely different times and places, all contributing to this library of texts. So you have to ask, how is it even possible to create a single, cohesive message with so many centuries and so many different hands involved? Well, that's the story we're going to follow. We're going to trace the journey of this book, from spoken stories to ancient scrolls, copied meticulously by hand, and somehow preserved through the rise and fall of entire empires to become the book we know today. All right, let's start at the very beginning. The origins of the Old Testament go way, way back into ancient history. It all began as spoken stories, long before anyone ever wrote a single word down. You see, the Bible is really two different collections of books. First up, you've got the Old Testament, which is this collection of texts written over more than 1,000 years, mostly in Hebrew and Aramaic. And then, much later, you get the New Testament. It was written in a tiny fraction of that time, in Greek, and it signals this huge new chapter in the story. The whole process was just incredibly gradual. I mean, for centuries, these were just stories being told around campfires. Then we start to see the first laws getting written down by Moses. Over the next 1,000 years or so, all this history, poetry, and prophecy was painstakingly recorded on scrolls made from animal skin. And finally, all these scattered texts were collected, organized, and recognized as something sacred. But that brings up a really big question, right? These scrolls were copied by hand, over and over, for centuries. How could we possibly know if the text we have today is anything like what was originally written? For a long, long time, the oldest copies scholars had to go on were from the Middle Ages, hundreds of years after the fact. And then, completely by accident, everything changed. In 1947, a shepherd was just wandering around near the Dead Sea when he stumbled upon a cave. And inside, he found these old clay jars holding ancient manuscripts. This discovery, well, it sent shockwaves through the entire world of biblical scholarship. They were the Dead Sea Scrolls, and here's the kicker. These texts were 1,000 years older than any Old Testament manuscripts anyone had ever seen. So when scholars compared them to the much later copies from the Middle Ages, they were absolutely stunned. The texts were almost identical. It was just incredible proof that the scribes who copied these things had been astonishingly accurate across a vast chasm of time. So, now let's jump ahead to the second part of the Bible. The New Testament actually came together much more quickly. It happened as the story of Jesus in the early church just spread like wildfire all across the Roman Empire. And if there's one key date to remember, it's this one. While all the individual books were written much earlier, it was around the year 400 AD that the church officially recognized the 66 books, combining the Old and New Testaments, that make up the Bible we have today. But this wasn't some arbitrary decision made by a committee in a back room. Long before that date, there was already a widespread agreement among early Christians about which texts were the real deal. Those official church conferences were really just giving a final stamp of approval to what believers were already using. For centuries, the Bible was locked away in Latin, a language only the educated elite could understand. So the next chapter in its history is a really dangerous one. It's the fight to translate it into English so that ordinary people could finally read it for themselves. And let me tell you, it was a dangerous fight. It started with early attempts by monks like Bede. Then a guy named John Wycliffe produced the first full English Bible, which made the authorities furious. A law was passed really quickly, making it illegal, but that didn't stop pioneers like William Tyndale. He had to flee England just to print his translation, a decision that would ultimately cost him his life. I mean, this just shows you the sheer dedication involved. To get these forbidden books to the people, Tyndale's supporters smuggled them into England hidden in bales of cloth. It was this high-stakes, secret operation, all fueled by the belief that everyone should have access to these words. But the tide was starting to turn.
First, the invention of printing made mass production possible. And second, big political shifts in England would soon turn this illegal, dangerous activity into a project endorsed by the king himself. The shift was just dramatic. In 1603, King James I actually commissioned a new official English translation. A team of 50 scholars went to work, and here's the ironic part. They built it on the foundation laid by William Tyndale, the very man who was executed for it. The result, published in 1611, was the King James Version, a book that didn't just shape faith, it shaped the entire English language. And that brings us to the modern era. The Bible's journey didn't just stop in 1611. In fact, its accessibility was about to explode on a global scale, moving from the printed page right onto the digital screen.
Just look at this growth. It's unbelievable. For most of its history, the Bible only existed in a handful of languages. But today, thanks to centuries of work by translators, parts of it are available in over 2,500 different languages. That means billions of people can read it in their own native tongue.
And the formats are just as diverse as the languages. You can read it online, listen to it as an audiobook, or even get a version written in modern-day slang. And yes, believe it or not, there is even an emoji Bible. The book just keeps on adapting to the times. Which brings us to a final, pretty remarkable fact. After this immense journey, spanning thousands of years, multiple continents, and huge technological revolutions, the Bible remains the most popular and widely distributed book in all of human history. You know, its story is one of incredible preservation, but also constant adaptation. From an ancient scroll to a smartphone app, it has always found a new form. And that leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to think about. What could the next chapter possibly hold for this ancient book?